I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Speaker, we need to look at this bill in the context of the housing crisis. The housing crisis which this government has constantly said doesn't exist. But home seekers know the truth. They know that home ownership is now only 65%, the lowest since 1951. And they know the reason, because home affordability has worsened in Auckland by 25% in the last year alone. The government's response to that has been utterly pathetic, in fact retrograde, as this bill demonstrates, by trying to get the state out of social housing, trying to fob it off onto often ill-equipped non-profit organisations. And it is now selling state houses at a time when they are needed the most, and to make matters worse by allowing them to be sold overseas. But John Key says that's okay. However, the vast majority of New Zealanders say that it's not okay, because they know that this bill and legislation like it is just another step in the wrong direction. It empowers ministers to direct the sale and transfer of housing corporation homes, ostensibly for housing reform objectives. But the main objective is to simply get the state out of social housing. So the real objective is to fast-track that process by giving ministers wide and indeed excessive executive powers, which are not usually given in any such circumstances. And actually the government knows that, because it's in its own disclosure statement it correctly says, quote, "The transaction mandate is an unusual mechanism. It provides ministers with the ability to effect the transfer of Housing New Zealand Corporation assets in Housing New Zealand Corporation's own name, without a decision-making role for the Housing New Zealand Corporation's board." So that raises the whole question about why they would bother to maintain such a board if in fact it is not allowed to make the decisions. And the reason, of course, is in fact the government doesn't trust it to do what the government thinks should be done. So the government wants to both pay the piper and play the tune itself. Nothing could be more inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. The bill allows ministers to take Housing New Zealand assets and sell them without any involvement at all of the board which governs the organisation that owns them. Very, very inappropriate and very bad law. This represents yet another extension of executive powers by the government. And Mr. Speaker, I have constantly complained in this House that the government is taking on more and more powers by the executive in several new pieces of legislation over the last few years, thus sidelining Parliament or sidelining agencies of government established with parliamentary authority. But that's not the worst demonstration of the arrogance of this government demonstrated in this bill. The bill allows land acquired by Housing New Zealand under the Public Works Act to be sold and transferred without complying with the usually required offer-back process. And the reason for that is obvious, and I agree with Materia Ture on this. Where Nick Smith was embarrassed by the lack of government land available in Auckland for new housing, as he claimed was available, he made reckless claims about how much land the government would dedicate for the purpose, without first checking if the land was in fact suitable for housing, and without first checking if some of it was actually legally available for housing. This bill is therefore designed as Nick Smith's face-saving device, nothing much more than that, by belatedly introducing this bill to allow the Public Works Act to be bypassed, and to hell with people for whom that process was intended to protect. The government simply doesn't care about their rights, and it wants to fast-track it, state housing privatisation program at any cost. Now, Alfred Nauru said in his speech that the Public Works Act has never applied to state housing. But, Mr. Speaker, that's only his opinion, and it's not actually the law. It's not actually what that Act says. And people only need to look at that legislation to know that. Mr. Speaker, there are 2,000 houses to be sold by this backdoor method. So who gets the proceeds, and what can they be used for? New Section 2A4 says that it must be paid to a Crown account. So what is its mandate for that money? How do we know whether the funds will go back into new social housing? There's nothing in the bill to describe that. So there are many unanswered questions about that. What we can be sure of is that this government will want to reduce the role of the state in the provision of social housing, despite the many people, the majority of people who are seeking the opposite. And despite the fact that without more, not less, government investment in housing, the housing crisis will in fact deepen and will never be solved. The rationale of this bill is ostensibly the pursuit of the objectives in new section 50D, which includes some of these, for example, C. Social housing tenants are helped to independence as appropriate. What does that mean? It means pushing people out of state houses. That's what it means. And another one, there is more diverse ownership or provision of social housing. What does that mean? Privatisation of state houses. That's what it means. And it goes on and on. More innovation. And the last one, the supply of affordable housing is increased, especially in Auckland. Yeah, right. How and by what process and by whom? Because it's not going to be by this government, that's for sure. Mr. Speaker, in the end, this is just another nail in the coffin of state housing in New Zealand. There is no reason for any confidence at all that any genuine effort will be put into the supply of more social housing in New Zealand as a result of this bill and the other legislation which this government has passed in the last few years. Nor is there any guarantee that the money will go into the improvement of social housing quality, which is so badly needed, or even that the proceeds from these sales will go back into social housing in any way whatsoever. And I've listened to the speeches from those opposite, and none of them have given me any confidence that that would be the case. None of that money, it seems to me, is actually likely to go back into state housing at all. The only thing we can be sure of, Mr. Speaker, is that this bill is driven, in fact, by National Party dogma and not genuinely by any social housing objectives intended to improve the lot of people who rely on state housing in this country. And more and more and more people will be relying on it because of the housing affordability crisis, because of the lack of opportunities to buy homes in New Zealand, which is also the direct fault of this government, which has spent so many years doing little or nothing about that whole state housing crisis. So in order to achieve this bill's real objectives, which are not state housing objectives, this government is willing to create in this bill unusual and excessive executive powers, and to use them to trample over the rights of people entitled to those offer-back provisions which they should be entitled to use. They are going to be, in fact, nullified by this bill, and they should not be. There is no need for it. There is no need, indeed, for the entire program of the privatisation of state houses. There is no need, indeed, for the transfer of state houses to anybody. And it wouldn't matter what philosophy you come from, whether you think they should be managed by the state or private interests. None of that justifies this bill, nor in the sale of state houses. So that's what it is about. It's about a sell-off, it's about privatisation, it's about the extension of executive powers in an unreasonable way. So for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, New Zealand First will certainly be voting against this bill now and at every stage.
Before I call the next speaker, I'd like to congratulate the member on his delivery. However, I'd like to remind him that he was a lot more eloquent when he wasn't reading from his notes, when he was speaking off the cuff and referring to notes. I call